I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
Okay, even though we are going to be starting at verse 7, we do need to read verses 4 to 8 to get back to our context so that we remember what we've been talking about. Remember, the fall of Babylon is being described here. An angel came down from heaven and cried that Babylon the Great had fallen and become the living place of demons for every foul spirit, unclean, and hateful birds. In other words, this is symbolism. And we had talked about how in the Old Testament, God had prophesied against Babylon, and how this really related to Rome in the book of Revelation, not the literal city of Babylon, but the Old Testament verses in Isaiah and Jeremiah would have been in the minds of those who received this book, received this letter from John, so that they could relate what God used in the Old Testament and relate it to what is being revealed here. So let's read verses 4 to 8. We'll start with Jeff, and we'll do one slide each. Jeff, then Gloria, and back to Tim.
Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities."
Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she makes. As she glorifies herself and lives in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, "I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see."
For this reason, her death will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who has judged her.
All right, so we have John hearing a voice that said, remember, it was saying, "Come out of her." It was warning the people who were not part of Rome, in other words, Christians, those who would be hearing these words, "Come out of her." And we talked about her sins had reached heaven, and God remembered her iniquities. So that meant that these people were not forgiven. Remember, when God forgives, He remembers our iniquities no more. So in other words, if these were forgiven people that was being talked about, God wouldn't remember their sins. Rome, though, wasn't forgiven. The Roman Empire was evil. Those people who were Christians needed to come out of Rome. In other words, if they weren't to partake in the sins that Rome had. If they didn't come out of Rome, they're going to receive the same reward that Rome does here. But that's not what God wants. He said, "Come out, so that you do not receive her plague." She is going to be rewarded according to her works. She's going to be rewarded the same way. And so that brought us to the question I told you we were going to end on. What did Babylon say of herself according to verse 6 and 7? Well, I guess it's verse 7, really.
I sit as a queen, I am no widow.
Yeah. I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I'll never see. That's
Very haughty.
very haughty, very arrogant. She lived she lived in luxury, and so God was going to give her torment and mourning, since she says in her heart, "I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I will never see." Remember, God said, I'm going to repay her according to her deeds. So she acted this way. I'm going to show myself to be God. I am going to give her the things that she thinks that she cannot have. She says she's a queen, I'm going to bring her down. She says she lives in luxury, I'm going to take that away. She says I can never mourn, she is going to mourn. And she thought of herself as invincible. In Isaiah chapter 47, we'll come back to Shedung. Isaiah chapter 47, verses 7 to 9, so we'll do Shedung and then we'll back to Leicester.
You said, I shall be mistressed forever, so that you do not lay these things to heart, or remember them end. Now, and therefore, hear this, your lot of pleasures, who said, secure me, who says in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children.
These two things shall come to you in a moment. In one day, the loss of children in widowhood shall come upon you in full measure, in spite of your men's sorceries and the bad hour of your temptations.
Sounds eerily similar. Remember what Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. Nations rise, and they believe themselves to be invincible. As we said last week, if we were able either to live long enough, or if we were able to invent a time machine and go into the future, 500 years, 1,000 years, what would we find? Do you think we'd find the same countries that exist on the earth today? I think we would surprise ourselves, because that has never been history. Nations rise and nations fall. Our history has always been, you just take a look at the last 1,000 years of recorded history. Europe was dozens and dozens and dozens of small little city nations. They weren't these big countries like France and Germany and Great Britain and Poland and all these other countries. They were small little cities. People expect nations just to go on forever and ever. What usually brings down a nation?
Another nation.
Another nation, of course.
Themselves.
And sometimes themselves. Absolutely. You get a more powerful nation, and the war breaks out. You get a nation that gets too high on itself, and it won't be able to protect itself. Babylon did that. Babylon, what was happening the night Babylon fell? The book of Daniel. What was happening?
Belshazzar was partying.
Yeah, big party. He was drinking, making merry. The very big party was happening in Babylon. And Cyrus came in the middle of the night. And it was just that quick. Babylon, the city, fell in one night. And so, nations think of themselves as invincible, but they're not. God rules in the affairs of men. Therefore, verse 8 says, her plagues are going to come at once. Death, mourning, famine, and fire. This is one of those verses that people try to read into and say, okay, that's Jerusalem. If you're wanting to know, there's, as we've said before, there's a debate among people who read this book. Is this Rome or is this Jerusalem? We've gone over the many different ways that this book really does tell us that this is Rome. However, this is one of those things. This verse here, talking about one day. The fall of Jerusalem happened very quickly. The Roman army surrounded Jerusalem, burned the walls of the city, burned the temple, and it happened very quickly. If something happens in one day, what is that describing? Swiftness. Swiftness. But remember, the book is symbolic. And so when we talk about one day or 1,000 years or 3.5 times or 7 times, we have stressed time and time and time again. If we're using symbols, let's not read literal things into those symbols unless it is just impossible not to. If there is, the Bible is to be taken literally unless the readings are obvious that this is talking about symbols and allusions and metaphors. But we can know that from the context. It's not that we decide, okay, this isn't literal. People want to do that with Genesis chapter 1. They want to do it with Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9. They want to do it with the events in the book of Joshua. Anything that involves miracles, they come along and say, well, that's just figurative. The context doesn't tell us that. The context doesn't lead us to those conclusions. However, the context here talking about dragons and beasts and other things, as far as these were symbols, they were about real events, but not literally. These symbols were to represent those events. So one day is very swift, as Gord said. It's very quick, and it's going to come. It's not going to be something that people wonder, okay, is this happening? God's judgment is going to come very quick. Let's get Isaiah chapter 47. Now we'll continue going through verses 10 to 15. We'll do Gord and Kala and then across, one slide each.
You felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. And you said in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. But evil shall come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, for which you will not be able to atone. And ruin shall come upon you suddenly, of which you know nothing.
Stand fast in your enchantments and your many sorceries, with which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you may be able to succeed. Perhaps you may inspire terror. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let them stand forth and save you. Those who divide the heavens, who gaze at the stars, who are the new moons, make known what shall come upon you.
Behold, they shall be as stubble. Fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. It shall not be a coal to be warmed by, nor a fire to sit before. Thus shall they be to you, with whom you have labored, your merchants from your youth. They shall wander, each one to his quarter. No one shall save you.
So this is a continuation of what we just read in Isaiah 47, talking about complete ruin. God is not going to allow these nations that practice evil, especially in Isaiah, where we're talking about literal nations here. If they grow too large, they get too big in themselves, they practice evil, God's going to judge them. And He's going to bring them down to ruin. Babylon was one of those cities that was going to be brought down. And so when we come to the New Testament, God, through this angel and through the writings of John, is warning Christians, Rome is going to be judged. You face these persecutions. You have faced all this terrible problems at the hands of the Roman Empire. God is not blind. God sees everything. Remember what He told one of the churches. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of righteousness. That's what He's wanting these churches to do. That's what He's wanting Christians to do. Be faithful. God is going to judge the nations that persecute you, If you are faithful, you will come through, and the church will come through. Christ will be victorious. That's the picture we're going to get in Revelation chapter 19 and Revelation chapter 20, that the Christ will be victorious over Rome and over any nation that comes against Christ's church. Any comments before we move on? Bill?
When we were talking about the one day, we got to look at that more as God's certainty.
Yes.
Because Rome didn't fall in a day.
No.
And if you're a Christian, you're going, well, what's going on? It's like 2 years of this. It's God's. He's in control.
Mm-hmm. That's my point when it comes to Jerusalem. People say, well, Jerusalem, that sort of fits the one day better than Rome. But, and that's why I was saying it was swiftness, it's not swiftness in effect that it might happen quickly. It was going to happen soon. And like as far as God was not going to wait 1,000 years to judge Rome, it was going to happen soon. And if you read history, Rome, you say, well, Rome fell, like as far as it took 400, 500 years for Rome to officially fall. But as far as its great power, it fell pretty quickly when you consider it. And the persecutions, they rose and they fall. And even this book is going to get that picture where there's going to be a time of less persecution, then there's going to be a time of more persecution. And so God's judging of Rome is going to happen soon. And as you say, like as far as Rome didn't fall in a day. And when people read this and they try to make it literal, they're going to say, well, they can't be Rome because they didn't fall in a day. It fits Jerusalem better because Jerusalem fell very quickly, but it doesn't fit other things. It's not that I want to be argumentative over things. I'm saying it doesn't fit the entire picture. And if it doesn't fit the entire picture, trying to force a literal reading into something that was meant to be figurative and symbolic, that's where we get into trouble. Lord.
No, you just said my point.
Okay. All right. Well, you and I often think on the same wavelength. You say so. We've got all of this. So let's read verses 9 to 19 in Revelation 18. We're to Tammy, and then we'll come over to Jeff and read around.
And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come.
And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood and all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble.
Cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots and slaves, that is, human souls, the fruit of which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and all your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again.
The mentions of this verse, who came first from the stone far off, is fear in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls.
For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste, and all shipmasters and seafaring sailors and all those ships on the sea too far off, and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. The city was like the great
and they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, cried out, honest, for the great city where all who had shipped at sea grew rich and fell back, for in a single hour she has been laid waste.
All right, so we have here a continuation of what we've been reading so far. And question 5 asks, what 3 classes weep when Babylon is punished? So in other words, we often think of classes of society. What 3 classes weep at the punishment, the judgment of God? Well, Bill, I think you had something.
The kings and the merchants, and then I guess the ship people, the
Yeah.
marine people.
So we could come along and say all of society. You think of kings and governments, all right? We often think of kings and governments, all right? They're at the top. They live in. If you think of queens and kings, people have been paying a lot of attention, or at least some people have been paying a lot of attention to the new baby of the royal family in England. And they live in the top of the wealth in England. And then under them we have merchants. They were the ones who sold things. And then we had the shipmasters and sailors, and we would come along and say, well, they were more of the normaler people. The merchants are going to be pretty wealthy, but they're not going to lead governments. They're not going to be the most wealthy. But so we have the 3 really strata of society. In other words, no one is going to be left out. Everyone is going to be amazed, and they're going to lament and cry for their destruction, because they are going to feel pain. They are going to have loss. Remember, mourning. God was prophesying this. And so the merchants who sold her everything and grew rich by their trade, they're now no longer going to have people to trade with. The kings are not going to be ruling the same way. And then the shipmasters mourn the loss of her trade as well, because usually when we think of job loss, okay, if General Motors decides to close a plant in Oshawa or in Woodstock, does that closure of the plant just affect the people that worked there? Why not?
Well, no, all the common, like us, we're kind of at the knees of all these big merchants. They control us in a way, and they think they have power.
Yeah. Well, you think about it. When governments fall, society. Let's just think about it for a second. When a government falls, when there's a coup in a country, what happens? Generally speaking, chaos. In other words, the rule of law is abandoned by people. It just seems like the government falls and people lose their minds. There's riots in the streets.
It doesn't have to be a government. There's big power outages.
Well, I was going to get to that. You're ahead of me. But we start at the top, and then it trickles down. So when the government, Gord was like, when the governments can't provide services, when the governments are incompetent, we run into the same problem. It trickles down to the rest of society. Getting back to my plant closure, though, when you have a plant closure, it affects the people who work there. What about the people who supply those companies? The people who drive for those companies? They don't necessarily work for the companies, they're contracted out to other places, and it trickles down. So in other words, when you punish the kings, all right, the kings, they were involved in leading the state and providing for the state. Now they don't have, they're not ruling, so they're out of power. The merchants who sold to them, all right, who are we trading with now? And then the people who moved around the goods, there's no goods to move around anymore because these companies aren't able to trade anymore. And so God's judgment here trickles down to all of society. This great nation, this great empire, is crumbling before their eyes. And it reaches all of society. In Jeremiah chapter 50, we'll come to James, Jeremiah chapter 50, verses 45 and 46.
Therefore, hear the plan that the Lord has made against Babylon, and the purposes that he has formed against the land of the Chaldeans. Surely the little ones of their flock shall be dragged away. Surely their fold shall be appalled at their fate. And the sound of the capture of Babylon, the earth shall tremble, and her cry shall be heard among the nations.
It's the same sort of picture. You go from the real picture in Isaiah and Jeremiah of Babylon falling. And the world would hear her cry, and they would lament for her. And that's why you get these pictures in Revelation. God is drawing from something that happened in the past. He is using figures of speech, language that he literally used before, and the people would be able to go to the scriptures to find out what he's talking about. This was not a mystery to those who were spiritual. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians. Those who are walking after the flesh, they don't understand spiritual things. Why? Because they don't read them. It's not that they have no ability to understand them. They have the ability to understand them, but they don't read the Bible, and so they don't understand what you're talking about. Spiritual people, they understand spiritual things. The church doesn't sit there and wonder, I wonder what God's talking about here. We might, 2,000 years removed, have a little bit of an issue here or there, recognizing, okay, we didn't live through this persecution, understanding every figure, but where the Old Testament reveals to us something, let's take account of what these people would have done. These people they were well versed in the Old Testament because up until the end of the first century when John was writing this book, that's all they had. They had the Old Testament that looked to Jesus. Now by this time, by the time of the book of Revelation, they would have had Paul's letters, because Paul had been dead. Paul was dead. They would have had Paul's letters. They would have had Peter's letters. Peter, by this time, is dead. They would have had most of the New Testament, because John, according to tradition, is the last of the apostles to die at the end of the first century. Most of the New Testament, if not all of the New Testament, they had, but before that time, not long before, they didn't have the entire New Testament. So they were well versed, especially the Jews, in the Old Testament. And they could say, oh, this reminds me of Isaiah, or this reminds me of Jeremiah. And so that's what we get. The kings that committed fornication with her, the empire, and lived deliciously or luxuriously, they'll lament. The empire's fallen. All these other countries, all these other kings that did business, they'll lament. The merchants that sold the empire everything and grew rich, they'll cry at her destruction because they'll no longer have people to sell to. And the shipmasters and the sailors, they're mourn for the loss of her trade. They're the ones who actually send the trade around. It trickles down through society. They're all going to be amazed. And they're all going to lament. They're all going to say, how did this happen? And it's because of God. Let's get Revelation chapter 18, verse 20. We'll go to Dion.
Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her.
That's a very important statement. Question 6 says, why were the apostles and prophets told to rejoice? What does verse 20 say? God has given judgment against her. God has avenged you. God, remember that we had the scene where the prayer, like the saints were under the altar and they were crying out with God to avenge them, and God said, "Not yet. The time is not yet. Soon I will judge." Here's the judgment. Here's the judgment. They were to rejoice that the saints were avenged, not by them, but by God. God was around. Remember, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. The church didn't raise up armies like the Pope did when the Crusades, during the Crusades. Church didn't raise up an army. God judged the Roman Empire. Hebrews chapter 10, we'll come up to Lisa. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 30 and 31. I've already quoted most of it for that, but...
For we know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God.
It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. We don't want to fall into the hands of the living God. In this context, it's warning, it's telling Christians, continue on in the faith. Continue. This is the same chapter where he says, don't forsake the assembling of the saints. But that's just a small piece of Hebrews chapter 10. Now that we know that Christ is the sacrifice, that he entered the temple, he paid the price for our sins, continue on in the faith. And in fact, the next chapter is talking about people who lived by faith. The Hebrew writer here gives examples of those who live by faith. But we need to remember, this vengeance is mine, I'll repay. The Lord will judge his people. The Lord is judge. And he will judge not only us, but he will judge nations. And it's a fearful thing to fall in the hands of the living God. We do not want to fall into his hands having done evil, because he will avenge those who do evil. Jeff?
Their rejoicing wouldn't be like a gloating,
No.
like happy that someone got it.
Yes.
Their rejoicing would be that they stood for the truth, and they have proven to be faithful and pure. They stood for what was right, and
Yes.
they have received good in the end.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point to make. As far as it wasn't rejoice that they're being cast away. We don't rejoice in that. When a person dies who is not a Christian, that's not something we rejoice in, no matter how evil they were. When Osama bin Laden was killed, America rejoiced. That should not have been the attitude of Christians, because another soul was lost. Did he do evil things? Absolutely. But he could have been forgiven by Christ had he come to Christ. Now, he didn't. And we know what the Bible would teach would happen to those who don't come to Christ. But that doesn't mean we get to rejoice over their death. However, because they stood for the truth, God, it is a point to know that God is the one who avenges. And that because they stood for the truth, they can rejoice that God saw what had happened, that they stood for the truth, that they were faithful, and that God didn't forget his people. That's why we aren't to avenge ourselves. That's why we're not to get back at other people. That's not our job. Our job is to teach the gospel and to show the people the example of how Jesus lived in our lives. God will judge. God is the judge of people. Let God do his job. It's often an old preacher saying is, don't whittle on the end of God's stick. You whittle, you're peeling away the stick. And so some people, we have this stick, it says, whittle on the end of your own stick. Do what God has told you to do. Let God do what God has told us he will do. And so our job is just to teach the gospel.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor